around that time, I'd been reading about neuroscientific approaches, such as predictive coding, inactivism, and so on. And a bit of a novice in the area of neuroscience myself, or an interested hobbyist, as it were. But both myself and the late Dinah Murray, who unfortunately passed away last year, were very interested in this area and how it related to both her ideas around monotropism and my own around double empathy. And we were really hoping to find an academic out there who was connecting up these dots, as it were. And lo and behold, I came across this paper that was kind of doing exactly that with some of these issues. And Dimitris was not aware initially of double empathy work when this paper was produced, but very similar conclusions, but with different background, different influences and so on of how one got there, it would seem. So, although some similarities as well. And so it's really, really interesting work to me personally, and I hope to everyone here too, and might show avenues for future research and ideas for the future of where we can take this forwards. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Dimitris. There will be time at the end for discussion and questions and so on as usual. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Damian, for the nice kind introduction. I just want to apologize. My connection was not very good in the private room, so I'm in a semi-open space. Please interrupt me in case my voice is not loud enough to be heard. Okay, please let me know. So, as Damian said, exactly, I have experientially making sense of autism and the other relevant human conditions from early age. So, and starting realizing from first-hand experience that this is not about individuals, let alone individual brains, but it's more about mutual, social, and also at times political issue to address. And so, with moving on with my academic education and research work later, I have put in these ideas more and more concretely and more formally, and which were expressed mainly in the theoretical paper of my PhD on dialectical misattunement. And at that point, I was not aware of. I'm coming from a more technical background. I studied engineering and neuroscience with some part-time philosophy modules and biomedicine. So I was not very closely in contact with the current sociological field, and I was not aware of a double empathy problem. But as soon as I realized the work of Damian, I dived in and I felt many commonalities. I think we share also some of the inspirations from philosophy. As you will see, my main philosophical influence comes from the school of thought called the Dialectics. And I think this broad school of thought has lent inspiration to many relevant theories in the social sciences over the last centuries. So with that note, I will start today's presentation. I will focus more on our empirical paper on how interpersonal similarity of autistic traits in the general population might predict friendship quality, and not as assumed in the past solely dependent on the traits per se. So what we want to argue here is that in our research, in our empirical research, both behavioral but also neuroscientific, we should not isolate the context from the whole image. In that case, not studying only individual brains, cut out from the general social interactions and sociocultural realm. So in that case, we try to test whether also the similarity or distance of autistic traits might predict some aspects of human relationships, as opposed to just study autistic traits for individuals. So that was the main motivation. So I'll start by giving the conceptual background of our thinking here in this framework. So one of the main pillars that this thought is based is the Bayesian brain hypothesis. Just to give a simple example for people to understand what is the Bayesian brain hypothesis, what is different from the other kind of cognitive theories, is that let's examine an example. So there is a lady in south of Greece, late for her work, and so when she wakes up, she is not sure what weather will be outside. So she thinks usually at that time of the year the weather is good, so she goes out without an umbrella. But unfortunately, her prediction of 0% probability of rain was wrong and she gets wet. The same happened in the second day. In the third day already, she predicts that the probability of rain might have increased this time in south of Greece. So, but still, it's just 25%. So she doesn't carry an umbrella yet. And after a week of experience, we see that she adjusts her beliefs. Now she's almost sure that it's going to rain tomorrow by 90% probability. So here we see how people can adjust their beliefs by combining previous experience with continuous incoming information. So that's a cardinal point of the Bayesian brain hypothesis. Second, let's examine another example. She then travels for an academic trip to Japan, where she heard from rumors that the weather is really good, so the same as in her place. So she goes out with the same belief of 0 probability of raining, but unfortunately she gets wet again. But already from the second day there, she decides to take the umbrella. So from a Bayesian brain hypothesis perspective, this is not completely surprising, because another cardinal aspect of this hypothesis formally is that our updating of beliefs is not arbitrary, but it's connected to the confidence we place in our prior beliefs compared to our incoming information. So here, her prior beliefs were less confident because it was not her previous experience that made her believe the 0% probability, but rather it was social rumors. So here we saw two cardinal aspects of this hypothesis that we can express formally in mathematical formulas. So we can express prior experience and incoming information and the relative confidence about these beliefs and how our beliefs will be updated with a classic Bayesian rule theory. So I will not go into details here, but I will just say that this apparently simple equation is powerful because we can formally state specific hypotheses we have about specific scenarios, from really simple ones to more complex when we advance this equation. However, as you might have noticed, the description of the cognitive apparatus of a human so far really notoriously resemble Plato's cave allegory, who imagine people just being experience the outer world by projections on the back wall of the cave of virtual objects and not the real life itself. So this idea on its original conceptions resembles this allegory, as it puts the human in a position where observing reality and or being able to observe only projections on the epithelia, sensory epithelia, the human never can really grasp reality, but only their projections by an observational stance. As we will see later, this kind of view has been widely criticized, and prime example is the work of my mentor, Leo Zilbach, and his colleagues on the second-person neuroscience perspective, where in this framework we try to study the brain not isolating from life, but rather embedded in social interactions. So the computational neuroscience field also pick up in the next years this issue and come up also with a second avenue for prediction error minimization, either through perception and or through action. So either we can change our beliefs to conform the environment, or we can change the environment itself. So this framework, as I said, it was criticized by many colleagues, and here in my own work, I also adopting a dialectical perspective. I try to reformulate some of the cardinal hypotheses. So dialectics emphasize unity of phenomena, inner contradictions, movement or change of phenomena, and try to overcome dichotomies such as the organism and the environment, the individual and the collective, but also who is patient and who is not in a given culture. So emphasis is given here not only in within level processes, but also between level processes across different scales. So here, our suggestion is that we should not isolate strictly and arbitrarily levels of description, let's say the physical and biological or the psychophysiological, but we should take into account the interconnection of the different levels at the same time. So following this line of thought, we also review the human becoming or human self as a dynamic process as opposed to a static entity, which is based on a mutual exchange between a dialectic process of internalization and externalization. So we internalize the world, which is inherently social in our bodily and brain function. We can discuss later this how this happens. It's not like magic that we just import others in our minds, but we literally internalize others, significant others, but also social reality in our bodily and brain function. And in turn, we externalize, like we co-regulate with others, this social structure. So our idea is conceptualized in the dialectical attunement, so that we try to attune to the world in a bidirectional way, both in the physical world, but most importantly, we focus on the social world and social interactions. So we both internalize others, but also co-regulate the environment with others. And so in a nutshell, interpersonal statistical regularities in our line of thought shape multiscale hierarchical models on an individual level and vice versa. So this can span or range from interoception and perception to decision making, all the way up to ontogenesis, culture, and phylogenesis. So we see multitude of timescales. So our thinking draws major inspiration by one century ago Soviet psychologists, developmental psychologists, who have proclaimed through others we become ourselves. So here also later we can discuss how we can really practically internalize social relations, especially when we are babies and vulnerable, how specific interpersonal caring are transformed into our mind as mental functions. So our view also shares a lot of inspiration by the enactivist camp, which tries to reformulate some major neuroscientific assumptions. And here my specific inspiration comes from the participatory sense making that ranges from the individual to really joint sense making in groups. Also, our methodologies are largely based on the so-called second-person neuroscience perspective, which claimed that neural processes in social interactions might be fundamentally different than operations we observe and we can track when we just observe social situations. So this move in social neuroscience was important in my mind because it went beyond the neurocentric approach of studying single neurons as a unit of analysis in order to understand human behavior, but went beyond the brain actually, try to understand human behavior by studying two or more brains and bodies at the same time. One can wonder here why this conceptual introduction might be even relevant to real life or empirical research. Here, for personal reasons also, we have focused on the example of autism, which has been traditionally conceptualized as autism spectrum condition, which has been described as a pervasive developmental condition, which is characterized by difficulties in social interaction and communication, as well as restricted interests and or sensory behaviors as a standard definition. So predominant approaches have been like theory of mind, social motivation, weak central coherence, executive dysfunction, broken mirror neurons, and the more recent Bayesian aberrant or inflexible precision updating. So I will not go into detail here. But we see that different cognitive theories have focused either in social or less social aspects of the condition. But even in the more social aspects of this, they remain methodologically individualistic. So they try to explain always difficulties or even so-called disorders observed in autism as an issue located in the on the individual and many times in the mind or brain, as these theories are cognitive inherently. So as we will see here, we take some motivation from this as a starting point, a critique of these early definitions of autism, and we move beyond the individual. So in our research, we asked why should we only study individuals and having like this blue versus the yellow person, whatever distinction this might be, let's say here autism or non-autism, and then we asked why don't we include mixed diets, and then of course research during the last decade also did that with the advance of social neuroscience. But here our framework make specific predictions already that also communicate by Damian Milton, for example, or the autistic community for long years, which I also observed in real life at autistic partners or communicators or groups of people might still continue communicating smooth with each other. So if we really want to take a scientific and naturalistic approach, which is agnostic to any bias in society, we should really study interactions between people and not focus only on single brains differences. So this can take even the approach of a continuum, not only be trapped in dichotomous distinctions like autism and non-autism, but one can trace. Of course, there are some qualitative differences also we can discuss, but one can check this kind of hypothesis and the attunement or misattunement of human interactions and relations across a continuum, both, for example, autistic traits, but beyond that to other human characteristics like backgrounds or cultures or educational backgrounds, for example. So, as Damian said, there is an intersubjective term currently ongoing regarding the research of autism. For example, an emblematic example is the double empathy problem. The last 10 years is driving also both conceptual and empirical work, having claimed that social difficulties often observed in autistic population might not be individual issues, but stem out of a two-way complication when people meet and interact. They are also largely in parallel, and activism and participatory sense-making approaches, which consider atypicalities as a different way of making sense and interacting with the world. And these theories also, at some level, have focused also on autism and the autistic interactions. Also, second-person neuropsychiatry from more the social neuroscientific and psychiatric field is the most relevant approach, stating that social difficulties in autism might be more likely or even only manifest in real-time social interactions, where in more detached scenarios of communication we might not have, not observe the same difficulties. And the dialectical misattunement hypothesis is the work we focus more here, is that highly relevant to all of the previous, that we don't see autism and any relevant condition as a disorder of the individual or a misfunction of a single brain, but rather as a cumulative interpersonal misattunement being unfolded in different timescales. So one can see a two-way movement from the initial intersubjective communicative gap to increasingly individual prediction and interaction styles and back. So we see that the more people develop diverging social expectation updating or social expectation generation, like social gestures or social thoughts, the more an increasing intersubjective community gap we can observe between people of different styles, and this can insert. And here, this is important to stress, in specific contexts, this can be enhanced. This doesn't mean that in all the contexts this can be enhanced. So, for example, in more exclusion, social structure that promotes more social exclusion, like standard schooling environments, for example, this can phenomenon can perpetuate and increase across time. But in other contexts, we can have the opposite dialectic, where the gap becomes lower and then the styles become more converging or more complementary. So interpersonal misattunement in a nutshell can be thought of as a disturbances of the dynamic and reciprocal unfolding of an interaction across multiple time scales, resulting in increasingly divergent prediction and interaction styles and vice versa. And here the hypothesis holds, used to hold real predictions. So when this paper was written a bit before 2015, there was, to the best of my knowledge, there was not explicit empirical research stating that. So our hypothesis then, in theory, was that, and also based on anecdotal evidence of real life, our hypothesis was that interaction within homogeneous dyads, or dyads that are tuned with each other, are expected to be smoother compared to heterogeneous dyads. So we operationalized that in our last research piece as a similar, in terms of autistic traits, but one can take other elements, and smoother communication we examined as a higher perceived friendship quality between pairs of friends. So in our methodology, in our empirical research, in this study, we studied the link between this similarity of autistic traits and the friendship ratings along a continuum. And we invited pairs of friends to our institute to complete questionnaires on their individual autistic traits, but also the quality of their concrete friendship of the other person, that they share with the other person. The demographics were that we invited around 150 neurotypical individuals of balanced sex, and 5 dyads were excluded due to family or romantic relationship, and the friendship duration was diverse, and their meeting frequency from a few times per year to daily, and their ages span a broad range from 19 to 50, and we have 34 female and 33 male dyads, but not mixed gender dyads in this research, to keep in this experiment to keep the variability of our variables more coherent. So friendship quality, you can see the distribution range from 0 to 6, and friendship duration from 0 to 30 years. Autistic traits were almost normally distributed around 0 and 35, and center around 15. So this broad range covers mostly the people without autism diagnosis, and their autistic traits mismatch. That means the difference between the autistic traits of each individual in a friendship varied from 0 to 50 to almost 17. And then we analyzed our data with simple statistical analysis, and here I present our results on the effect of, or not effect actually, but bidirectional relationship of interpersonal similarity of autistic traits to friendship quality and duration. So, sorry if this is getting a bit low. Wait a second. So we see here that individual friendship quality did not significantly interrelated with individual autistic traits. On the left panel, we observe that up, and at the bottom of the left panel, we see that friendship duration neither was interrelated with individual autistic traits. On the contrary, the mismatch of autistic traits was interrelated significantly with both quality of friendship and duration. So the more similar people were in autistic traits, the more satisfied on a statistical level, of course, were with their relationship. That doesn't hold for all of our participants, just a trend. So that result was survived statistical correction irrespective of friendship duration, age, sex, or dyadic autistic traits, if people were high or low on autistic traits. The key constituents of friendship quality was acceptance, closeness, and help that predicted our results. So people felt more accepted, more close, and more helped by people more close in terms of autistic traits. Here is some statistical analysis. We can skip that, but we see that friendship quality and friendship duration was predicted in the majority of the cases by the similarity of autistic traits. Turning into the discussion, we here speculate. We did not control for all these processes, but we can speculate here, hypothesize for future more fine-tuned experimental paradigms that one can see a cyclic movement starting from higher interpersonal attunement, going to smoother social interactions, so that people that feel more and are more attuned in different levels of interaction, they can interact smoother, and their communication become in turn more rewarding, and this reward enhance interpersonal attraction, and this interpersonal attraction in turn can increase motivation to interact with each other and their success in interaction. And in turn, we have at the end a more tuned couple of friends or other kind of relationship. Our study here, of course, have certain experimental limitations, and that show the way to future direction. For example, we did not cover the whole autism spectrum here, including autistic, neurotypical, and mixed diagnostic groups will be of paramount importance. More fine-grained mechanisms can be tracked and studied using some line of thought starting from interpersonal attunement, not only in experiential aspects, but also in automatic facial expressions, for example, or eye movements, as well as all the way down to bodily reflexes and brain function of two or more people. So we can also study further context of interpersonal attunement from romantic or working relationship to more linguistic and psychophysiological alignment in real time. Also, because here we studied a more broad time scale starting from few months to several years. We can also study how these processes unfold in real-time contexts. Also, we can include more heterogeneous population from mixed gender diets and other cross-cultural diets or diverse sexual orientation and social class. And also replicating with larger population samples would be of paramount importance. We want to draw statistical safe conclusions. In the last few years, we also increased explosion of empirical research that incorporate more and more the double empathy problem and relevant interpersonal human processes, and they have been documented nicely in recent papers like entry in Encyclopedia for the double empathy problem, but also a recent review of Davis and Crompton, where they asked what do new findings about social interaction in autistic adults mean for neurodevelopmental research. Also, in our own line of thoughts, we focus more and more on more fine-grained measures. So we also transfer our experiments into the lab in order to control for specific variables and also measure process at the scale of milliseconds. So 1,000 times per second processes, like, as I mentioned, brain function, but also other bodily responses like eye movements and facial expressions. Of course, in certain experiments like here, we compromise in ecological validity, like how this scenario does not represent real life as closely as other ways of research, such as the ethnographic or other frameworks. Here we use dual brain recordings like dual EEG from the upcoming and always developing lately field of social neuroscience. So in the future also we transfer that to other contexts. I'm soon going to travel to Japan to repeat some of our experiments in clinical settings and also more sophisticated MRI scanners in order to go deeper into the brain and also understand specific, the neural, if you want, the neural reflection of our interpersonal attunement always between people and not only within people. Here you see an example of how we analyze automatically facial expressions, and we, in high resolution, try to interrelate subjective experience and failures or success of interaction with real-time bodily communication, both within our conscious or reflective space, but also beyond. Also, we transfer this work into the computational domain, so we try to build computational models in order to delve deeper into both simulated scenarios, but also real empirical data of different levels. And here our work is to push the field beyond individual models of cognition, all the way to intersubjective models of behavior. And this will be, I think, very relevant to the double empathy problem, as double empathy problem inherently does not consider individuals, does not pinpoint the issue to specific neurons, but rather ontologically the problem is located beyond the brain in the communication of people. So we go also more refined, also defining variables both for regarding exteroception and interoception. And we can discuss later if you want more details about what is this process and how this can contribute to individual responses and how this can merge in collective behavior in a cultural broader environment. So if these hypotheses are correct, at least in certain contexts, I mean the intersubjective approach to autism, then we can see psychopathology not only in autism, but generally psychopathology wherever we observe that, or social difficulties. We can observe it as a mismatch in social interpersonal communication and not as an individual problem. as many times current sociopolitical frameworks have taught to understand. So here we can then move even in our diagnosis or treatment of difficulties of psychopathology generally in the population, not by only focusing on retuning and adjusting the person with a difficulty, but also the broader social communication, broader social environment and their interactors. For example, by information campaigns but also by changing the structure of interactions and the communication media in order to be less dependent to power imbalances and structural inequalities, but also to facilitate communication by utilizing suitable cultural but also technological media. In education, for example, where I observed for some years, one can think of not only focusing on intervention in regards with autistic individuals, autistic pupils, but also all the class together. So at the end, we have a tuned group that can understand and respect each other ways and not trying to adjust any given individual back to an incidental majority. Then we resemble the last centuries where people were forced to adjust to given religious or other frameworks, otherwise were completely excluded or even executed. So our take-home message of this empirical and conceptual research is, and this refers more to the empirical article, is that our results here of the interrelation between the mismatch of autistic traits and the friendship quality lends support to the idea of an interactive and relational term in the study for social abilities across the autism spectrum, covering from one side to the other, and pave the way for future studies on the multiscale dynamics of social interactions that will include more levels of description from the brain all the way up to social factors. By taking atypical social interaction seriously in terms of both research and practice, we believe a voice is given to the most relevant part of the population for this endeavor, and which is not other by the primarily affected persons themselves. In our topic today, in the autistic individuals. Such a perspective eventually aims at not merely treating the autistic individual, but rather cultivating an interpersonal safe space where both sides will be able to meet and adapt to the expectations of each other without power and structural inequalities and imbalances. Here I would like to thank you very much for your kind attention. And also I would like to thank my co-authors in this paper, primarily my mentor Leonard Zilbach, but also my brilliant collaborators Juha Lachnakowski, Zane Tam and Daniela Seidel, but as well as our research assistants at that time, Milena Alexic, Berlinisa Jan, Lioba Enk, Dorotina Ismaili, Carolina Nafziger, and Uta Snyder, as well as Edzem Tavasioglu, for their invaluable support in these research lines back into the Max Planck Institute of Psychiatry. With this, I would like to conclude my discussion, and I'm happy to discuss further with you in case you have any concrete question. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that. There's something that came up in the chat forum earlier was a comment saying that it didn't seem to unlike social motivation hypothesis. I think it's quite different there to social motivation or motivation deficit. So I was just seeing what your view on the differences are and how would you see it differently.
So the question, if I understood correctly, was that our approach here resembles the social motivation hypothesis?
Yeah.
So okay. I see. Mm-hmm. Yes. No, actually, it's exactly it's nice to be given this opportunity to clear up these kind of points. It's actually exactly opposed to the social motivation hypothesis in a dialectical way. So I will explain what that means. So we don't exclude motivational factors in this process. In my opinion, at least, I don't know if Damian agrees, both in the double empathy problem perspective and our interpersonal misattunement perspective, which are really converging. So I wouldn't say that these intersubjective approaches are aligned with cognitive hypotheses such as the social motivation hypothesis, because for the fundamental reason that we don't focus on individual problems, but we focus on matches and mismatches in social communication between people. So in this case, dialectically, we see a movement, and in the article we explain this concretely, that autistic individuals, for example, talking for this topic, but I believe also in other kind of where we observe interpersonal matches or mismatches, autistic individuals are not lacking inherently social motivation to interact. Quite the opposite many times. People crave to interact, but the dominant sociocultural environment exclude certain styles of interaction, and this can impact back to the motivational strength, I think, of certain individuals. Persons are expectable to be affected in terms of motivation when they faced with obstacles and exclusions, of course, and can be withdrawn, for example, or lose interest. So, but by no means we think that this is the cardinal aspect of autism. So yes, if I have time, I can also refer to an example I like to state relevant to motivation. Motivational aspects where I was doing research in Ireland. I was having qualitative interviews with parents of autistic children, and then one mother, I remember, told me her little boy said to her, "Oh, Mom, I would really love my sister had a tail, if my sister had a tail." And the mother said, "Why are you saying that?" And the boy said, "Because I would understand when she's happy. Because it's so easy with dogs, you can understand when they're happy, they move their tail quickly. But I can understand when my sister is happy." And the sister, at that time, she was a baby. So that's an important point. So the mother actually has tried to support the kid, both in school and outside. So they had some so-called training programs to support the kid in domains that he thought might have some difficulties. For example, the parents thought maybe they could teach what the facial expressions, because it was not so intuitive for this boy. So they really taught for a long period of time by presenting photos to the boy of happy faces or sad faces and explaining what is its expression. So the mother asked him, "But we have discussed about that long. Why is it difficult for you to understand the emotion of your sister?" And the boy replied, "Because my sister, I understand that people when are happy they show their teeth, but my sister doesn't have teeth to show me, and so for me to understand." So here we see a different learning style and making sense of regularities. It does not imply at all a lack of motivation to interact with others. Or on the contrary, this boy was facing some difficulty to interact with his sister, and he asked his mother. So we see this. We can see this kind of, which we see this more broadly in on school environments where, many times, autistic individuals are excluded by a more dominant so-called neurotypical sociocultural framework and teaching style, and we can see how certain, not all, autistic pupils can lose interest in participating in teaching activities or other social activities. I have observed this when I was talking to autistic pupils.
It's an important point to recognise is the impact on social motivation of negative social experiences, of being judged, discriminated against, mocked and teased at school and things, and how that can embed in terms of social motivation and anxiety. And I've certainly come across autistic people who have suggested that, like one person I met said they don't do social, but to me it was socializing in a non-autistic kind of cultural setting and framework. Did that person need good social relations and understanding from their support workers and so on that worked with them? I would think so. And so even though in some respects they were not socially motivated, there was deeper reasons, and in some respects they still were. And this was quite an unusual case, because I've met many thousands of autistic people now, and I would say social motivation does vary in context, but at times people are highly socially motivated. And it's an important point that sometimes one's put off by negative experience. So what being picked up may be more a response to an unfriendly world than being autistic.
Hi, Damian. I'm just going to interrupt you and say you have 5 minutes left, and I think Caden has put one last question in the chat there for you.
Okay, I'll scroll down. What would you say the main differences are between double empathy problem and dialectical misattunement hypothesis? Do they predict any different outcomes or mechanisms, or are they completely complementary extensions of each other? It's hard for me to see differences in what they would predict in a way. It's really making very similar points, but slightly different angles of how they've been arrived at or how they've been articulated. I think there's nuances in things like how it operates, mechanisms, different outcomes, and that we're yet to find out. And a lot of this work is exploratory in terms of the finer details, but it's, other than that, I would say they would predict very similar things from what I've seen so far. That's my view on it. I think they are largely complementary. I guess there are differences in some of the models, sorts of in activism and predictive coding, and some of those issues. There might be very nuanced differences that appear in different accounts, but I would say the similarities are far greater in this area. What would you say, Dimitris?
Yes, I fully agree. So eventually different perspectives and different theories tap into same phenomena, and their and different ideas when they're in parallel converging. I believe it's also a collective issue. So I believe that it's like the state of the social development produces theories. So it's I take here a more materialistic approach. So certain material conditions might have enable these sorts of thinking as opposed to previous centuries, for example, or years or decades. So I believe also it's I see that a lot of research from different perspectives converts in tapping into relevant issues, and so I think this is a nice example where the two perspectives have some complementary but different also origins, but they converge they overlap largely at some points. For example, when both claim that we should pay attention to communication between people and not only individuals, and be agnostic where the difficulty stems from either the individuals and might be. I think they converge in this dialectical bidirectional issue, but also methodologically differ because but they are not opposed to each other, so they are I believe they're complementary. So our work is based largely on the field of computational neuroscience, so we also take into consideration specific models of brain function and bodily function, but also take inspiration from philosophy, and especially social philosophy and the dialectics. And I think that's how also theories converge with each other, because they share the same social real, in the same cultural and time context. But also I think with Damian we have also some overlaps in our inspiration from philosophy. So I really believe these perspectives are more complementary rather than opposing or tautologies.
I think another area there's convergence over is monotropism theory.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
The convergence with predictive coding theory and so on. Dinah Murray and myself presented some of our ideas to Cole Friston and colleagues a couple of years ago, and there's very strong parallels between the early thinking around monotropism and how some of these theories are being applied to autism. And yes, there have been differences as well. So some of the earlier work, neuroscientific approaches, held a somewhat deficit model still of autism, and inflexibility and terms like this were being used. But then over time, that's lessened somewhat, I would say, and descriptions are more neutrally framed these days, and there's recognition of autistic voices, lived experience research. And so in the past you've had a lot of people say, well, double empathy and monotropism kind of together explains a lot. Well, this kind of work's doing a very similar thing, I think, and bringing these different aspects together and narrating, really. It's very complementary, I think, all of these kind of approaches.
Yes, I very much agree. Also, just incidentally, personally, the first theory I fixated in my thinking was monotropism. When in my first project, I wrote about autism or participated in a project for autistic education. We used actually monotropism as a theory to state in our work that autistic thought is not it's just another style of being and thinking, and nothing more or less than that. So our main idea then, our main motto then was we don't see autism as an illness, but as a way of being. So that was our motto in this project, and it was exactly through monotropism we try to personalize the idea that of different style. Later, I was more attracted to or equally attracted to fine-grained neuroscientific approaches like predictive coding. And this, in my mind, with predictive coding, we can generalize some of the hypotheses of monotropism and extend the idea to the whole generation and updating of expectations. Actually, exactly there, like by combining social considerations about human communication and these neuroscientific approaches, I would say there is where our perspective lies, and how also I think meets and complements the double empathy problem.
We've gone slightly over, but perhaps the final question is, where do you see future of this work? Where would you like to see things go with your future work?
Yeah, thank you very much about this question too. So in my future work, ideally, I would like to go extend in both directions. Firstly, get more into the real life, the more socio-political realm. So I want to see change there in educational settings, for example. Also, my initial involvement with this work was through the educational field, because my first project was an educational environment for autistic children to be more socially included. And I want to see real change in the society. And even more, I can see different social groups. I don't see only people being complementary in terms of autistic traits, but also in terms of cultural backgrounds and many other aspects. I would like to see political change here of a world more inclusive. And I think autism is a very nice example to start with. And the autistic community is powerful enough, I think, to make a change. So one thing is there. I would like to see our research go more, leaving the empirical strict research going to the more sociocultural, sociopolitical realms. And from the other side, I would, in parallel, try in my research work to include more and more fine-grained units of analysis, also checking, like monitoring also subjective experience and real-life relationships, but also at the same time understanding some of the reflecting mechanisms to bodily processes and neuronal processes. So I want to see how different levels of human being and human becoming are interrelated from the biological level up to the socio-political level, and then shed some light, at least in some of the mechanisms between these levels, in order to facilitate social change or towards a more inclusive world. I think here also, I guess with Damian's work, I think we share a lot of overlap in terms of at least some of these aspects on real life. I think also Damian and yours and your colleagues' work also directed in real life settings.
Yeah, I have a very similar ethos and focus about practical and social change, and the research to inform that. And what's the point of doing research if it's not going to help positive social change? And so many of the projects I'm involved with in education, in mentoring projects I was involved with, is things that might have practical positive outcomes for the participants involved, for one, and for others if the findings are useful for others. So it's and research should help social activism and social change to inform it, and vice versa. So yeah, I have a very similar want to socially situate the double empathy, the misattunement hypothesis type work, because of power dynamics of what's needed on a social level. But also, like Dimitris, I would like the fine-tuned sort of technical mechanics of it all looked into. I'm probably not the best person to do a lot of that work myself, but I'm certainly encouraging of it and would be involved in advising and that kind of thing if people wanted. So I'm quite hopeful of the future of this work and the impact it can have. So I guess on this kind of coming together, synchronicity is a good point to finish on, and a positive note. So I'd like to thank Dimitris and everyone for coming today. I'm sorry we didn't publicise the event wider. We had a bit of postponements because of illness and things like that, and so hopefully get back on track with publicising events in the Journal Club in future. So look out for more work from Dimitris and co, because it's interesting stuff. So thanks.
Thank you very much for inviting and for your really insightful questions. And I will be very happy, yes, in the future to come closer and join forces in certain levels of the research effort.
Thanks, everyone.